Hi, I'm Amanda Parker. Last Christmas, my family made me sleep in a freezing garden shed while they celebrated inside our warm family home. They said there wasn't enough room, that I should be grateful they even let me stay on the property. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that I had quietly purchased all their overdue property taxes 6 months earlier. That little piece of paper in my pocket gave me more power than they could ever imagine, and by New Year's Eve, I would use it to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. The December wind cut through the thin walls of the garden shed like needles, and I could hear the warmth of Christmas Eve dinner floating across the backyard from the main house. Laughter echoed through the frosted windows, the clinking of wine glasses, and my mother's voice raised in that performative joy she reserved for family gatherings. Through the small shed window, I watched the golden glow spilling from every room of the house I'd grown up in, the house where there apparently wasn't space for me anymore. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders and checked my phone. It was only 7 in the evening, and the temperature was already dropping below freezing. The portable heater I'd bought with my last paycheck hummed weakly in the corner, barely making a dent in the bitter cold that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice. This wasn't supposed to be my life at 26. This wasn't supposed to be how Christmas worked, but this was the Parker family way. Brandon got the master bedroom with the ensuite bathroom and heated floors. Brandon got the prime rib and the good wine and the seat at the head of the table next to Dad. Brandon, who hadn't held a steady job in 3 years, who'd blown through 2 college funds and maxed out 3 credit cards in Mom's name, got to be the golden child while I got the shed. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was the one with a steady income, the one who'd never asked them for money, the one who'd actually tried to help when their financial problems started surfacing. But somehow, in the twisted logic of the Parker household, that made me less valuable, not more. Success made me threatening. Independence made me expendable. I'd driven up from Milwaukee that morning, my car loaded with carefully wrapped Christmas presents and a bottle of expensive wine I'd saved up for. I'd been looking forward to this for weeks, imagining a normal family Christmas for once. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe this year, they'd see me as more than just the family disappointment who'd chosen a boring accounting job over Brandon's more exciting but completely fictional career as an entrepreneur. The first sign something was wrong came when I pulled into the driveway and saw Brandon's BMW parked in my usual spot, the one right next to the front door that had been mine since I'd gotten my license. I'd parked behind Mom's Honda instead, telling myself it didn't matter, that it was just a parking space. The second sign was when I walked through the front door with my arms full of gifts and luggage, expecting the usual chaotic welcome, and, instead, found Mom standing in the hallway with that tight smile she wore when she was about to deliver bad news wrapped in false sweetness. "Amanda, honey," she'd said, not moving to help with my bags, not giving me the hug I'd been expecting. "We need to talk." Dad emerged from the living room, his face already set in that disappointed expression I knew so well, the one that said I'd somehow failed before I'd even spoken. Brandon appeared at the top of the stairs, leaning against the banister with a smirk that made my stomach turn. He was wearing an expensive-looking sweater I'd never seen before, probably another gift from the parents who claimed they were barely scraping by. "There's been a situation," Mom continued, her voice taking on that careful, measured tone she used when she was about to make something unreasonable sound perfectly logical. "Brandon's going through a difficult time right now, and he really needs the support of being in his childhood room. You understand." I didn't understand. Not yet. I was still thinking this was about bedroom arrangements, about some minor reshuffling to accommodate everyone's comfort. I was still naive enough to think there was a reasonable explanation coming. "So where am I sleeping?" I asked, setting my bags down carefully, still holding on to the hope that this was just a minor inconvenience. that they'd set up an air mattress in the office or cleared out space in the basement. Well, Dad cleared his throat, looking everywhere except at me. The thing is, Brandon's also been using the guest room as his office space, and the basement has that moisture problem we told you about. The silence stretched out, filled only by the sound of Brandon's barely contained laughter from the stairs. That's when it hit me. They weren't trying to find me a place to sleep. They were trying to find a way to tell me there wasn't one. The shed, Mom said finally, the words coming out in a rush like she was ripping off a bandage. We've cleaned it out, and there's electricity. You could think of it as camping. You always loved camping when you were little. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for someone to break character and admit this was some kind of elaborate joke. But Mom's smile was getting more strained by the second. Dad was studying his shoes like they held the secrets of the universe, and Brandon was now openly grinning. You want me to sleep in the garden shed, I said slowly, each word feeling surreal as it left my mouth. In December, in Wisconsin. It's not that bad, Brandon chimed in from the stairs, his voice dripping with false concern. We put a space heater out there and everything. Besides, you're always talking about how independent you are. Here's your chance to prove it. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. This wasn't about space or convenience or Brandon's emotional needs. This was about putting me in my place, about making sure I understood exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. The shed wasn't just where they were making me sleep. It was where they thought I belonged. The shed doesn't even have insulation, I managed to say, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. It's going to be below freezing tonight. You'll be fine, Dad said dismissively, finally looking up from his shoes. It's just for a few days. And honestly, Amanda, you might want to think about whether this is really the best time for a visit anyway. We're dealing with some financial stress right now, and having extra people around is just complicated. Extra people. As if I were some random house guest they'd reluctantly agreed to accommodate, not their daughter coming home for Christmas. As if the presents I'd carefully chosen and wrapped weren't sitting right there in plain sight. As if the last 26 years of my life had somehow been erased, leaving me standing in their hallway as nothing more than an inconvenience. I brought gifts, I said weakly, gesturing toward the bags at my feet. I brought wine. I thought we were going to have Christmas dinner together. Of course we are, Mom said quickly, her voice bright with false enthusiasm. You're still family, Amanda. You're still invited to everything. We just need to be creative about the sleeping arrangements. Creative, that's what they were calling it. Making your daughter sleep in an unheated shed during the coldest week of the year was creative problem-solving. I'd stood there for another few minutes, listening to them explain the logistics of my exile as if they were doing me a favor. There was a camping toilet they'd put out there, and I could come inside to shower, though they'd prefer if I did it early in the morning or late at night so I wouldn't interfere with Brandon's schedule. I could join them for meals, of course, but I should probably eat quickly since they'd need the dining room for Brandon's video calls with potential investors. Every word felt like another small cut, another reminder that I had become surplus to requirements in my own family. I'd nodded along, agreeing to their conditions because the alternative was driving 4 hours back to Milwaukee and spending Christmas alone in my apartment. At least this way, I'd told myself, I'd still get to be part of Christmas morning, still get to maintain the illusion that we were a family who cared about each other. But sitting in the shed now, watching my breath form clouds in the frigid air, I was starting to realize that the illusion was all I'd ever really had. The truth was that I'd been sleeping in the metaphorical shed for years, relegated to the margins of their attention, tolerated rather than loved. This was just the first time they'd made it literal. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment, my heart leaped with the hope that maybe one of them had come to their senses. Maybe someone was texting to invite me inside, to apologize for this insanity. Instead, it was from Brandon. "Hope you're staying warm out there. Mom made hot chocolate. Smells amazing." I stared at the message, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't just neglect or thoughtlessness. This was deliberate. This was punishment. But punishment for what? For having a job? For paying my own bills? For not being the kind of person who needed constant rescue and validation? I scrolled through my contacts until I found Aunt Carol's number. She was Dad's sister, the one family member who'd always seemed to see through the family's carefully constructed narratives. If anyone would understand how surreal this situation was, it would be her. "Amanda?" Her voice was warm and concerned when she picked up on the second ring. "Sweetie, how's Christmas Eve going?" "I'm sleeping in the garden shed," I said, without preamble, because there was no way to ease into that conversation. "They said there wasn't room in the house." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When Aunt Carol finally spoke, her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "They put you in the shed? In this weather? Amanda, that's not just cruel, it's dangerous. Do you have heat out there?" "A space heater," I said, surprised by how much her outrage comforted me. After hours of being told this was perfectly reasonable, it was a relief to hear someone acknowledge how wrong it was. "This is about Brandon, isn't it?" she said, and I could hear her moving around, probably pacing like she did when she was upset. "Let me guess. Golden Boy needed his space and you got volunteered to make the sacrifice. How did you know?" "Because it's the same pattern they've been following since you two were kids," she said bluntly. "Brandon gets whatever he wants, and you get told to be grateful for the scraps. The only difference is that now you're old enough to see it clearly." I'd never heard anyone in the family speak so directly about the obvious favoritism that had shaped my entire childhood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was like hearing someone finally acknowledge that the sky was blue after years of being told it was green. "I keep thinking I must be overreacting," I admitted, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around me. "Maybe it really is just about space, and I'm being too sensitive." "Amanda, listen to me." Aunt Carol's voice was fierce. "Normal families don't make their children sleep in freezing sheds during Christmas. Normal families figure out a way to make room. Normal families prioritize their children's safety over convenience. What they're doing to you is not normal, and it's not okay." Hearing her say it made something inside me crack open, a wall I'd built to protect myself from seeing the situation too clearly. I'd spent so many years making excuses for them, finding reasons why their treatment of me wasn't as bad as it seemed, convincing myself that I was being too demanding or too sensitive. But sitting in that freezing shed, listening to the sounds of warmth and family drifting across the yard from the house where I wasn't welcome, I couldn't pretend anymore. "I don't know what to do," I whispered. And for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt tears threatening to spill over. "You survived tonight," Aunt Carol said firmly. "You get through Christmas and then you start making changes. You're 26 years old, Amanda. You have a good job, your own place, your own life. You don't have to keep coming back here to be treated like this. But they're my family. Family is supposed to love you, support you, make you feel safe and valued. What's happening to you right now isn't family. It's dysfunction disguised as tradition." After we hung up, I sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to the wind rattling the shed walls and thinking about what she'd said. I'd been so focused on trying to earn their love, trying to prove that I belonged, that I'd never stopped to question whether the love I was chasing was real or just something I'd imagined. The space heater cycled off with a click, and the temperature in the shed immediately began to drop. I checked the time on my phone and realized it was only 9 o'clock. I had at least 10 hours before morning, 10 hours of trying to stay warm in a space that was never meant for human habitation in winter. I thought about the folder of documents I kept in my car, locked away in the glove compartment where no one would think to look. 6 months ago, when Dad had been complaining about property taxes and threatening to lose the house, I'd done what I always did. I'd tried to help. But instead of just giving them money they'd probably waste, I'd gone to the courthouse and quietly paid off the entire tax debt myself. The house they were so casually exiling me from? The house where Brandon was sleeping in comfort while I shivered in the shed? I owned the tax lien on it. If they defaulted on their payments to me, which they would since they didn't even know the debt existed, I could legally force a sale. The house they took such pride in, the house that had been in the Parker family for 3 generations, was one missed payment away from being mine. At the time, I'd planned to tell them eventually, maybe on Christmas morning. I'd imagined their gratitude, their relief, their recognition that I'd saved their family legacy. I'd pictured Dad putting his arm around me and finally acknowledging that I'd done something valuable, something worthy of respect. But sitting in the shed, watching my breath form clouds in the frigid air while they celebrated warmth and family inside the house I'd secretly saved, I started to think about a different kind of Christmas morning revelation. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for David Morrison, the lawyer who'd handled the tax lien paperwork. It was late, but David was an old college friend who owed me a few favors. If anyone would take a call on Christmas Eve, it would be him. "Amanda?" His voice was surprised but not annoyed. "Everything okay?" "I need to ask you about the Parker property tax situation," I said quietly, glancing toward the house to make sure no one was coming outside. Hypothetically, what would happen if I decided to exercise my rights as the lien holder? There was a pause, and I could almost hear him switching from friend mode to lawyer mode. Hypothetically, you'd have several options. You could demand immediate payment of the full amount, plus interest and penalties. If they can't pay, you could force a sale of the property. Or you could negotiate a payment plan with terms that you set. And they'd have how long to respond? Depends on how you structure it. You could demand payment within 30 days, or you could be more generous. It's entirely up to you as the lien holder. I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. For the first time since I'd arrived. "David, I think I'm going to need you to draw up some papers." "On Christmas Eve?" "The best Christmas gifts always come at the last minute," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "I'll pay your holiday rate, whatever it is, but I want everything ready to go by tomorrow morning." "Amanda," his voice was careful, "are you sure about this? Whatever's happening there, once you pull this trigger, there's no going back. Family relationships are complicated, and legal action tends to make them more complicated." I looked toward the house, where the Christmas tree lights twinkled in the front window and the sound of Brandon's laughter carried clearly across the frozen yard. They'd made their choice about what our family relationship was worth. Now it was time for me to make mine. "I'm sure," I said. "Draw up the papers. I'll explain everything tomorrow." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my family. I felt powerful. For once in my life, I held all the cards, and they had no idea the game had even started. The space heater kicked back on with a mechanical wheeze, and I settled back into my sleeping bag, no longer quite so focused on the cold. Tomorrow was Christmas morning, and I had a very special gift planned for the Parker family. One they'd never forget. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made the air itself feel sharp against your skin. I'd managed maybe 3 hours of sleep, waking up every time the space heater cycled off and the temperature plummeted. My phone showed it was 6:30 in the morning, and through the shed's small window, I could see the main house was still dark except for the kitchen light. I'd learned to recognize the rhythm of the Parker household over the years. Mom would be up first, starting the coffee and prepping for the elaborate Christmas breakfast she'd been planning for weeks. Dad would shuffle down around 7, grumbling about the cold and demanding to know why the thermostat was set so high. Brandon wouldn't emerge until at least 9, expecting everything to be ready and waiting for his grand entrance. This year, though, I had my own schedule to keep. I unzipped the sleeping bag and immediately regretted it as the cold hit my body like a physical blow. The portable heater had been working overtime all night, but the shed's complete lack of insulation meant it was fighting a losing battle. I could see my breath in thick clouds, and when I touched the metal walls, frost had formed on the inside surfaces. Moving quickly to generate some warmth, I pulled on the extra layers I'd kept in the sleeping bag with me overnight. Thermal underwear, wool socks, a heavy sweater, and the winter coat I'd initially thought would be overkill for a family Christmas. Everything felt stiff from the cold, but at least I'd stayed warm enough to avoid hypothermia. My phone buzzed with a text from David. The message was simple but perfect. "Papers ready. Merry Christmas." Attached was a PDF that made my heart race with anticipation. Official legal documents demanding immediate payment of the property tax, debt plus 6 months of accrued interest and penalty fees. The total amount was now just over $18,000, due within 30 days of service. If payment wasn't received, the documents clearly stated my right to force the sale of the property to recover the debt. I read through the papers, twice, marveling at how different everything looked when it was written in legal language. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or family dynamics anymore. This was about contracts and obligations and consequences. This was about power shifting hands in a way that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. The kitchen light in the main house flickered off, then back on. Mom was definitely up, probably wondering if she should check on me in the shed or just pretend. Everything was normal. I'd noticed that about the Parker family over the years. When they did something cruel, they preferred to act like it had never happened rather than acknowledge the cruelty. It was easier to maintain their self-image as good people if they never had to directly confront the impact of their actions. I gathered my toiletries and clean clothes, steeling myself for the awkward process of getting ready for the day. According to the rules they'd established yesterday, I was allowed to use the bathroom in the house, but I was supposed to be quick and considerate of Brandon's schedule. The idea that I needed permission to shower in my childhood home was still surreal, but I was done being surprised by their capacity for petty cruelty. The back door was unlocked, as it always was during family gatherings. I slipped inside as quietly as possible, hoping to avoid any early morning confrontations. The warmth of the house hit me like a wall, making me realize just how cold I'd actually been. My fingers and toes started tingling as blood flow returned to normal, and for a moment I just stood in the mudroom savoring the simple luxury of heated air. The sounds of breakfast preparation were coming from the kitchen, along with the rich smell of coffee and bacon. My stomach growled loudly, reminding me that I'd barely eaten anything yesterday. The granola bar I'd had for dinner seemed like a distant memory, and the idea of sitting down to Mom's famous Christmas breakfast was almost enough to make me forget about the legal papers waiting on my phone. Almost, but not quite. I made it to the upstairs bathroom without encountering anyone, though I could hear voices starting to drift up from the kitchen. The hot shower was a revelation after a night in the unheated shed, and I stood under the spray longer than I probably should have, letting the warmth soak into my bones. When I finally stepped out, the mirror was completely fogged over, which seemed appropriate somehow. Everything about this Christmas was obscured by steam and confusion. As I was getting dressed, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the bathroom. Heavy, deliberate steps that could only belong to Brandon. He knocked on the door with the kind of aggressive impatience that suggested he'd been waiting specifically for me to finish. "How long are you going to be in there?" His voice carried that edge of irritation that had become his default tone when addressing me. "Some of us have important calls to make this morning." Important calls, on Christmas morning. I wondered what kind of business Brandon was conducting these days, given that his last 3 startup ventures had crashed and burned spectacularly. But questioning Brandon's professional activities was one of those family taboos, right up there with mentioning his credit card debt or asking why he'd never held a job for more than 6 months. Just finishing up, I called back, making sure my voice sounded appropriately apologetic. Let him think I was still playing by their rules. Let him think I was still the accommodating daughter who would step aside whenever he demanded space. I opened the bathroom door to find him leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, wearing an expensive-looking robe that I was certain hadn't been paid for with his own money. His expression was the same mixture of entitlement and disdain I'd grown up with, the look that said I was somehow inconveniencing him by existing in the same space. "Thanks," he said with exaggerated politeness. "I hope you managed to stay warm enough out there. It's supposed to get even colder tonight." The casual reminder that I'd be spending another night in the shed was delivered with just enough fake concern to maintain plausible deniability. He wasn't being cruel, he was just stating facts. He wasn't enjoying my discomfort, he was just making conversation. The sophisticated cruelty of it was almost impressive. "I'll manage," I said, stepping aside to let him pass. "I'm more resilient than people give me credit for." Something in my tone must have caught his attention because he paused and looked at me more carefully. For a moment, I thought he might actually register that I seemed different this morning, that the defeated acceptance he was expecting wasn't quite there anymore. But then his phone buzzed with a notification and his attention immediately shifted. "Investor call from the West Coast," he said importantly, as if I'd asked. "Big opportunity. Could change everything for the family." I nodded appropriately and headed downstairs, leaving him to his delusions of entrepreneurial grandeur. The kitchen was in full Christmas morning chaos when I arrived, with Mom orchestrating the breakfast preparations like a military commander. Bacon sizzled in one pan while she scrambled eggs in another, coffee percolated on the counter, and the oven timer was counting down to fresh biscuits. "Amanda." Her voice was bright and cheerful, as if the shed situation had never happened. "Perfect timing. I was just about to send someone out to get you. Send someone out to get me, like I was livestock that needed to be rounded up for feeding time." But her smile was so warm and genuine that I could almost believe she didn't realize how her words sounded. Almost. "It smells incredible in here," I said. And it was true. Whatever else could be said about Mom, she knew how to create a perfect Christmas morning atmosphere. The kitchen was warm and bright, filled with the scents of comfort food and fresh coffee, decorated with holly and red ribbons that made everything feel festive and welcoming. "I made your favorite coffee cake," she said, gesturing toward a pan cooling on the counter. "I know you probably didn't sleep well, so I thought something sweet might help." The kindness in her voice was real, and for a moment, I felt the familiar tug of confusion that had defined my relationship with my parents for years. How could the same woman who had banished me to an unheated shed also remember my favorite coffee cake? How could someone who claimed to love me be so casual about putting me in danger? "That's thoughtful," I said carefully. "I appreciate it." Dad wandered into the kitchen wearing his Christmas morning uniform of flannel pajama pants and the university sweatshirt he'd had since before I was born. His hair was sticking up in several directions, and he had the slightly dazed expression of someone who hadn't quite finished his first cup of coffee yet. "Morning, Amanda," he said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "How was your night? Everything okay out there?" The question seemed genuine, as if he was actually concerned about my welfare. But then I noticed the way he avoided making direct eye contact, the way his attention immediately shifted to the coffee pot, and I realized he was asking because he felt obligated to ask, not because he wanted to know the answer. "Cold," I said simply. "But I survived." "Well, that's good," he said, pouring himself a generous mug of coffee. "Character building, right? When I was your age, we didn't have all these modern conveniences. A little cold never hurt anybody. Character building. As if deliberately making your daughter sleep in sub-freezing temperatures was some kind of life lesson rather than simple cruelty." as if 26 years of life hadn't already provided me with sufficient character development. Opportunities. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Brandon's voice drifting down from upstairs, apparently deep in one of his important phone calls. His tone was confident and persuasive, full of business buzzwords and promises of revolutionary market disruption. I'd heard similar calls over the years, always with different investors, always with the same outcome. Eventually, the money would run out, the investors would disappear, and Brandon would move on to the next big idea that was definitely going to change everything. "He's been working so hard on this project," Mom said, following my gaze toward the ceiling. "It's really going to be something special. He's talking to investors in California who are very interested." "What kind of project?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Something with technology," Dad said vaguely. "Apps or websites or something like that." "I don't really understand it, but Brandon says it's the future." Brandon always said his projects were the future. The problem was that the future kept arriving without him in it. But pointing out this pattern was another family taboo, so I just nodded and helped Mom set the table for Christmas breakfast. The dining room had been transformed overnight into a winter wonderland, with holly centerpieces and red cloth napkins and the good china that only came out for special occasions. 4 place settings were arranged around the table, each one perfectly, positioned with military precision. 4 settings for 4 people, which meant I was included, at least for meals. It was a small kindness that I probably should have been grateful for, but instead it just reminded me of how conditional their hospitality had become. Brandon finally appeared just as Mom was pulling the biscuits out of the oven, his hair perfectly styled and his clothes carefully chosen to project success and confidence. He'd changed into dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, and he carried himself with the kind of self-assured swagger that suggested his phone call had gone well. "Sorry about that," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the table like it was his natural place. "West Coast investors, you know how it is. They don't really understand time zones." None of us knew how it was because none of us had ever had West Coast investors, but we all nodded appropriately. The Parker family had become expert at pretending Brandon's fantasies were real, mostly because the alternative was acknowledging that our golden child was a 30-year-old man with no job, no prospects, and no apparent intention of ever supporting himself. Breakfast was elaborate and delicious, exactly the kind of Christmas morning feast that should have created warm family memories. Mom had outdone herself with homemade biscuits and gravy, perfectly scrambled eggs, thick-cut bacon, and her famous coffee cake. Everything was presented beautifully, served on the good china, accompanied by fresh orange juice and strong coffee. Under normal circumstances, I would have savored every bite and complimented every dish. I would have thanked Mom for the effort she'd put into making the morning special and asked for the coffee cake recipe I'd never actually received, despite years of requesting it. I would have played my part in the family performance, pretending that sitting down to a beautiful meal could somehow erase the fact that they'd made me sleep in a freezing shed. But these weren't normal circumstances, and I wasn't the same person who had driven up from Milwaukee yesterday morning. The legal papers on my phone had changed something fundamental about the dynamic, even though they didn't know it yet. For the first time in my adult life, I held all the power in this family, and it was a strange and intoxicating feeling. "This is incredible, Mom," Brandon said, loading his plate with a second helping of everything. "You really outdid yourself this year." "I just wanted everything to be perfect," she said, beaming at his praise. "Christmas is so important for family bonding." Family bonding. I wondered if she could hear the irony in her own words, or if the cognitive dissonance of talking about family bonding while one family member had been exiled to the backyard was just too much for her to process. "Speaking of family," Dad said, setting down his coffee cup with the kind of deliberate gesture that suggested he was about to make an announcement. "There's something we need to discuss with everyone." The tone of his voice made my stomach clench. This was the voice he used for serious conversations, for disappointing news, for moments when the family mythology was about to collide with reality. Brandon looked up from his plate with sudden attention, and Mom's smile faltered slightly. "We've been dealing with some financial challenges lately," Dad continued, his words careful and measured. "Nothing dramatic, nothing that can't be handled, but we're going to need to make some adjustments going forward." Financial challenges. That was one way to describe the mountain of debt they'd accumulated over the years, the missed mortgage payments, the overdue property taxes that I'd secretly resolved 6 months ago. It was another way to avoid taking responsibility for decades of poor financial decisions and enabling Brandon's expensive lifestyle. "What kind of adjustments?" I asked, though I suspected I knew where this conversation was heading. "Well," Mom jumped in, her voice taking on that bright, false optimism she used when delivering bad news. "We're thinking it might be time for everyone to contribute a little more to the household expenses, just temporarily, until things stabilize. Everyone." As if this conversation included Brandon, as if he would be expected to contribute anything beyond his charming presence and entrepreneurial vision. As if the person who'd been sleeping in the shed was somehow equally responsible for solving the family's financial problems as the person who'd been living rent-free in the master bedroom for 3 years. "Brandon's got his investment opportunities," Dad said, apparently reading my thoughts. "So we don't want to interfere with that. But Amanda, you've got that steady job, and we were thinking maybe you could help out with some of the monthly expenses. Just until Brandon's projects start paying off." There it was. The real reason for the Christmas invitation, the real purpose behind gathering the family together. They needed money, and I was the only one with a reliable income. The shed wasn't just punishment for refusing to fund Brandon's retreat. It was negotiation strategy, a way of making me uncomfortable enough to agree to whatever financial arrangement they proposed. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Maybe $1,000 a month?" Mom suggested, as if the number had just occurred to her rather than being carefully calculated in advance. "Just to help with the mortgage and utilities and things like that. $1,000 a month. $12,000 a year, paid to people who thought so little of me that they'd made me sleep outside in December. $12,000 to subsidize Brandon's lifestyle while he pursued another guaranteed-to-fail business venture. $12,000 for the privilege of being treated like a second-class family member." "That seems reasonable," Brandon said, speaking for the first time since the conversation started. "I mean, we're all family here. We should all be pulling in the same direction." Pulling in the same direction. From the person who hadn't pulled anything except money out of the family accounts for years. The audacity was breathtaking, but also predictable. In Brandon's world, other people's contributions were just the natural order of things, no more remarkable than gravity or sunrise. I took a bite of coffee cake, savoring the sweetness while I considered my response. 6 months. Ego, I probably would have agreed immediately. I would have been grateful that they were asking for help rather than demanding it. Thankful that they still considered me part of the family financial unit. I would have seen it as an opportunity to prove my value, to demonstrate that I was worth keeping around. But that was before the shed, before spending a night in sub-freezing temperatures while they celebrated warmth and comfort inside the house I'd secretly saved from foreclosure. Before watching them discuss my financial contributions while casually planning for me to sleep outside for multiple nights. "I'll need to think about it," I said finally. $1,000 a month is a significant commitment. The silence that followed was thick with tension. This wasn't the response they'd expected, and I could see them recalibrating their approach in real time. Mom's smile became more strained, Dad's expression more serious, Brandon's casual confidence slightly less secure. "Of course," Mom said, quickly. "We don't expect an answer right away. Take all the time you need. but her voice suggested that taking time was actually the last thing they wanted me to do. They needed an answer soon, probably before I left to go back to Milwaukee, probably before I had time to fully process what they were asking and what they were offering in return. "It's just that things are getting pretty tight," Dad added, his tone shifting towards something that might have been desperation if I hadn't known better. "The property taxes alone are killing us, and if we can't get caught up soon—" He let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished but clearly implying disaster. The property taxes that were killing them, the ones I'd already paid in full 6 months ago. The crisis that existed only in their minds, only because they hadn't bothered to check their account statements carefully enough to notice that their debt had been mysteriously resolved. I felt the phone in my pocket, heavy with the weight of legal documents that could end this conversation permanently. All I had to do was pull it out, show them the papers, explain that their financial crisis was imaginary, and their demands for my money were both unnecessary and insulting. I could watch their faces change as they realized that I held the real power in this situation, that their threats of foreclosure were empty because I already controlled their fate. But something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity about how far they would push this charade. Maybe it was a desire to see exactly how much they thought my family membership was worth. Or maybe it was just the realization that once I revealed my hand, there would be no going back to any pretense of normal family relationships. "I understand the situation is difficult," I said carefully, "but I think Christmas morning might not be the best time for major financial planning. Why don't we table this discussion until after the holidays?" The suggestion was reasonable, the kind of mature response that should have been welcomed by parents who claimed to want thoughtful consideration rather than immediate decisions. But I could see the frustration in their faces, the barely concealed annoyance at having their timeline disrupted. "Sure," Dad said, though his tone suggested it was anything but sure. "We can talk more later. But Amanda, I hope you understand how serious this is. We're not just talking about belt-tightening here. We're talking about potentially losing the house." Losing the house. The house that had been in the Parker family for 3 generations. The house that represented their legacy and their identity. The house that I'd saved without their knowledge or gratitude. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it, but I just nodded seriously and promised to give their request the consideration it deserved. The rest of breakfast passed in relative quiet, with everyone focused on their food and their own thoughts. The easy family chatter of earlier had evaporated, replaced by the kind of tense politeness that indicated everyone was thinking about the conversation that had just occurred. Mom kept glancing at me as if trying to read my thoughts. Dad stared out the window with the distant expression he wore when he was worrying about money, and Brandon seemed absorbed in his phone, probably researching whatever investment opportunity he'd discussed during his morning call. When the meal was finally over, I volunteered to help with cleanup, partly out of habit and partly because I wanted a few minutes alone with Mom to gauge her real feelings about the situation. But as we stood side by side at the kitchen sink, washing the good china and putting away the breakfast leftovers, she seemed determined to avoid any serious conversation. "I hope you know how much it means to us that you're here," she said, scrubbing a plate with unnecessary vigor. "Family is so important, especially during the holidays." "Even when family members have to sleep in the shed?" I asked, keeping my tone light but pointed. She paused in her washing, her hands still in the soapy water, and for a moment I thought she might actually acknowledge the elephant in the room. But then she resumed her scrubbing with renewed energy. "You're being very mature about the whole situation," she said. "Not everyone would be so understanding." Understanding. As if my failure to cause a scene about sleeping in sub-freezing temperatures was somehow praiseworthy, rather than simply evidence of how thoroughly they'd trained me to accept unacceptable treatment. As if my willingness to pretend this was normal was a virtue rather than a survival strategy. I finished drying the last plate and hung up the dish towel, suddenly feeling exhausted despite the early hour. The emotional energy required to navigate these conversations, to parse the hidden meanings and unspoken threats, to maintain the pretense that we were a loving family working through temporary difficulties, was more draining than a night in. The cold shed. "I think I'm going to take a walk," I said. "Get some fresh air before present opening." "Don't go too far," Mom said, though whether that was concern for my safety or a desire to maintain control over the day's schedule was unclear. "We'll probably start with gifts around 11. I bundled up in my winter coat and stepped outside, into the crisp December air. The cold didn't feel as brutal now that I was properly dressed and knew I'd be going back inside soon, but it was still sharp enough to remind me of the night I'd just endured. The shed looked even more pathetic in daylight, a ramshackle structure that no reasonable person would consider suitable for human habitation in winter weather. But as I stood there looking at it, I felt something unexpected. Not shame or anger or self-pity, but a strange kind of pride. I had survived their test, whether they'd intended it as one or not. I had endured their cruelty and emerged stronger, clearer, more certain of my own worth and their fundamental inability to see it. The legal papers in my phone felt like a secret weapon, a hidden ace that transformed everything about this dynamic. They thought they held all the cards, thought they could manipulate me with financial pressure and emotional blackmail. They had no idea that I'd been holding the trump card all along, that their threats were empty and their power was an illusion. I pulled out my phone and read through David's documents one more time, imagining the look on their faces when they realized what I'd done. The shock, the confusion, the slow dawning understanding that their financial salvation had been in their midst all along, unrecognized and unappreciated. By the time I walked back into the house, I'd made my decision about timing. Christmas presents first. Let them enjoy their morning of gift-giving and family togetherness. Let them bask in the illusion that everything was normal, that their manipulation was working, that I was the same compliant daughter who would eventually agree to subsidize their lifestyle indefinitely. Then, when they least expected it, when they were most comfortable in their assumptions about how this day would unfold, I would give them the gift they'd never forget. The gift of truth, wrapped in legal documents and tied with a bow of consequences they'd never seen coming. The morning was about to get much more interesting. The living room had been transformed into a magazine-perfect Christmas scene, with wrapped packages arranged artfully under a towering Douglas fir that sparkled with white lights and silver ornaments. The morning sun streamed through the bay windows, casting everything in a warm golden glow that made the whole scene look like something from a holiday card. If you didn't know about the shed situation, you might actually believe this was a happy family gathered for a traditional Christmas morning. Mom had changed into her Christmas dress, a deep red velvet number that she'd been wearing on December 25th for as long as I could remember. Dad wore his holiday sweater, an elaborate Nordic pattern in green and gold that made him look like an oversized Christmas elf. Even Brandon had dressed up for the occasion, trading his casual morning attire for pressed khakis and a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, settling on dark jeans and a simple black sweater that felt appropriate for what I was planning. Nothing too festive, nothing that would suggest I was fully invested in the family holiday charade. I wanted to look put together but not celebratory, present but not committed. "Amanda, you sit here," Mom directed, patting the spot on the couch next to her. It was the same spot I'd occupied every Christmas morning for years, close enough to be included in family photos but positioned so that Brandon would be the natural center of attention when the gift opening began. The presents under the tree were distributed with the usual Parker family hierarchy clearly visible. Brandon's pile was impressive, a mountain of carefully wrapped packages in expensive-looking paper with elaborate bows. My stack was considerably smaller, maybe 5 or 6 gifts total, wrapped in what looked like leftover paper from previous years. But it wasn't just the quantity that told the story. It was the quality of the wrapping, the size of the packages, the obvious care that had gone into Brandon's presentation versus the utilitarian approach taken with mine. His gifts looked like they belonged in a store window display. Mine looked like afterthoughts. "Who wants to go first?" Mom asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical. In the Parker family, Christmas morning always began with Brandon's gifts, moved through Mom and Dad's exchange, and ended with whatever was left for me. It was a tradition so established that questioning it would have seemed absurd. Brandon settled onto the floor next to his pile with the practiced ease of someone who'd been the center of Christmas attention his entire life. He selected the largest package first, a rectangular box that was nearly 3 feet long and wrapped in silver paper with an enormous gold bow. "This one's from Mom and Dad," he announced, though we could all see the gift tag. He unwrapped it, with theatrical care, peeling away each piece of tape and folding the paper neatly, drawing out the suspense for maximum effect. Inside was a professional photography kit, complete with multiple lenses, lighting equipment, and a camera body that I recognized as being worth several $1,000s. Brandon's face lit up with genuine excitement as he pulled each component from its protective packaging. "This is incredible," he breathed, holding up the main camera like it was made of gold. "This is exactly what I need for the content creation side of the business. Visual marketing is going to be huge next year." Content creation, visual marketing. I wondered what kind of content Brandon was planning to create with his new equipment, given that his previous ventures into social media had resulted in exactly 17 followers and 3 awkward videos about cryptocurrency that had been viewed a total of 42 times. "We thought it might help with your new project," Dad said, his voice warm with pride. "Every successful entrepreneur needs the right tools." The camera kit alone probably cost more than I'd spent on Christmas gifts for the entire family combined. It was the kind of extravagant present that suggested either unlimited financial resources or a complete disconnect from reality. Given the conversation about needing my financial contributions that had occurred less than 2 hours earlier, I was betting on the disconnect from reality. Brandon continued through his pile with the methodical enthusiasm of a child who'd never learned that Christmas presents weren't guaranteed. Expensive headphones for his podcasts that didn't exist. A leather jacket that cost more than most people's car payments. A high-end laptop computer for his business ventures. A smart watch that tracked fitness metrics for someone who hadn't exercised voluntarily since high school. Each gift was greeted with appropriate enthusiasm and gratitude. Each one was photographed from multiple angles for social media documentation. And each one added to the growing pile of expensive items that someone who claimed to be financially struggling had somehow managed to afford. "Your turn, honey," Mom said to Dad when Brandon's pile was finally exhausted. They exchanged gifts with the comfortable efficiency of people who'd been married for 30 years, each one receiving exactly what they'd asked for and nothing more. A new set of golf clubs for him, a spa weekend package for her. Practical presents. That suggested a relationship based more on routine than romance, but delivered with enough affection to maintain the illusion of marital happiness. Then it was my turn. I approached my small pile with none of Brandon's theatrical enthusiasm, partly because I'd learned not to expect much, and partly because my mind was occupied with other things. The legal documents on my phone felt heavier than any physical present, and I found myself distracted by thoughts of timing and presentation and the exact words I would use when the moment came. The first package was from Mom, a rectangular box, wrapped in recycled paper from what looked like last year's Christmas morning. Inside was a generic scented candle set, the kind of gift you buy when you need something to put under the tree, but haven't actually thought about what the recipient might want or need. "I thought these would be nice for your apartment," Mom said, her voice bright with false enthusiasm. The lavender scent is supposed to be very relaxing. Relaxing, as if my main problem in life was insufficient relaxation rather than a family that treated me like an inconvenient houseguest in my own childhood home. But I smiled and thanked her appropriately. adding the candles to the small pile of opened gifts beside me. The second present was from Dad, a book about personal finance and building wealth through smart investments. The irony was breathtaking, given that he was currently asking me for money to help solve financial problems that I'd already secretly resolved. But the title suggested he'd actually put some thought into the gift, even if the thought was somewhat misguided. "I saw this at the bookstore and thought you might find it interesting," he said. "It's never too early to start thinking about long-term financial planning." Long-term financial planning. From a man who'd let property taxes accumulate to the point of potential foreclosure, who'd enabled his son's expensive lifestyle while claiming to be broke, who was currently unaware that his daughter owned a lien on his house. The cognitive dissonance was almost impressive in its completeness. Brandon's gift to me was a coffee shop gift card for $25, presented in an envelope that looked like it had been repurposed from some other occasion. It was the kind of present that suggested he'd remembered he needed to get me something approximately 10 minutes before gift opening began. "I know you're always drinking coffee," he said with a shrug. "Figured you could use some variety from whatever cheap stuff you make at home." Cheap stuff, because apparently my coffee choices were somehow inferior to his sophisticated palate, even though he'd been drinking the same Maxwell House that Mom bought in bulk from the grocery store warehouse. But criticism disguised as gift-giving was classic Brandon, and I accepted the card with the same gracious smile I'd perfected over years of similar presentations. The last few gifts were equally uninspired. A pair of gloves that were the wrong size, a calendar featuring cats in costumes that suggested someone had confused me with a completely different person, and a small picture frame that was clearly meant for a photo I'd never been asked to provide. By the time I'd opened everything, the contrast between my pile and Brandon's was so stark it might have been intentional. He'd received thousands of dollars worth of professional equipment and luxury items. I'd received maybe $60 worth of generic gifts that could have been purchased for anyone. But the real gift wasn't under the tree. It was in my phone, waiting for the right moment to transform this entire morning from a celebration of Parker family dynamics into something else entirely. "Well, that was wonderful," Mom said, beginning to gather up the wrapping paper with the efficient motions of someone eager to move past the present opening portion of the day. "I think we should get some photos before we start cleaning up." Photos, of course. The Parker family Christmas morning photo session was as traditional as the gift hierarchy, and just as carefully orchestrated to present the right image to the outside world. Mom would arrange us in front of the Christmas tree. Brandon would be positioned prominently in the center, and I would be placed strategically to the side where I could be cropped out later if necessary. But this year, I had a different kind of photo session in mind. "Actually," I said, standing up from the couch with deliberate casualness, "I have something I'd like to share with everyone first." The tone of my voice must have carried something unexpected, because all three of them looked up from their various activities with sudden attention. Mom paused in her paper gathering, Dad stopped adjusting his new golf club, and Brandon glanced up from photographing his camera equipment. "What kind of something?" Mom asked, her voice carrying just a hint of concern. I pulled out my phone, scrolling to David's email with the legal documents attached. My heart was beating faster than it had all morning, but my hands were steady as I opened the PDF files and prepared to share them with the family. "I wanted to talk about the financial situation you mentioned at breakfast," I said, keeping my voice calm and conversational. "About the property taxes and the risk of losing the house." Dad's expression immediately became more serious, and he set down the golf club entirely. Brandon stopped taking pictures and focused on me with the kind of attention he usually reserved for potential investors. Mom's paper gathering slowed to a stop. "We don't need to get into all that right now," Dad said quickly. "It's Christmas morning. We can discuss business matters later." "Actually, I think this is exactly the right time," I said, holding up my phone so they could see the document displayed on the screen. because it turns out the property tax situation isn't quite what you think it is. The silence that followed was the kind of complete quiet that occurs when people sense something significant is about to happen, but haven't quite figured out what it is. I could see them trying to process my words, trying to understand why I would be bringing up property taxes on Christmas morning, trying to figure out what information I might have that they didn't. "What do you mean?" Mom asked, her voice careful and controlled. "I mean that 6 months ago, when you were talking about how stressed you were about the overdue taxes, I went to the courthouse and paid them," I said, watching their faces carefully as the words sank in. "All of them, the full amount plus penalties and interest." The reaction was immediate and varied. Dad's mouth actually fell open, creating an expression of surprise so complete it might have been comical under different circumstances. Mom blinked rapidly, as if trying to process information that didn't quite make sense. Brandon's expression shifted from confusion to calculation, probably trying to figure out how this development affected his own financial situation. "You paid our property taxes?" Dad repeated slowly, as if saying the words might help him understand them better. "I paid the outstanding debt, yes," I said, pulling up the specific document that showed the lien transfer. "But technically, I didn't pay them for you. I paid them for me." Now the confusion was deeper, tinged with the first hints of concern. I could see them trying to work through the implications, trying to understand what I meant by paying the taxes for myself rather than for them. "I don't understand," Mom said, her voice smaller than it had been moments before. "When you pay someone else's delinquent property taxes, you don't just clear their debt," I explained, holding up my phone so they could see the legal language displayed on the screen. "You acquire what's called a tax lien, which means that if the property owners don't pay you back, with interest, you have the legal right to force the sale of the property to recover your money." The silence that followed was profound. I could practically see the gears turning in, their heads as they worked through what I'd just told them, as they began to understand the full implications of my Christmas morning revelation. "You own a lien on our house," Brandon said finally, his voice flat with disbelief. "I own a lien on this house, yes," I confirmed, "for the full amount of the tax debt, plus 6 months of accumulated interest and penalties, which, according to the current calculation, comes to just over $18,000. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. $18,000. More money than any of them had in savings, more than Brandon had earned in the past year, more than they could realistically pay without selling significant assets or taking on additional debt. "But your family," Mom said, her voice taking on that pleading quality she used when she was trying to appeal to my better nature. "You wouldn't actually. I mean, you're not seriously suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything," I said calmly. "I'm explaining the legal reality of the situation. You owe me $18,000, payable on demand, secured by this property. That's not a suggestion or a threat. It's just a fact." Dad had moved to the couch and sat down heavily, his face pale with the kind of shock that comes from having your entire understanding of a situation suddenly and completely overturned. Brandon was staring at his new camera equipment as if it had suddenly become evidence of poor financial planning rather than Christmas generosity. "This is insane," Brandon said, his voice rising with the first traces of anger. "You can't just secretly buy our house debt and then hold it over our heads. That's not how family works." "You're right," I agreed. "That's not how family works. Family doesn't make each other sleep in freezing sheds during Christmas. Family doesn't demand financial contributions from the only member with steady income while spending thousands on photography equipment. Family doesn't treat love like a conditional contract based on financial usefulness." The words came out with more heat than I'd intended, carrying months of accumulated frustration and hurt that I'd been pushing down in the interest of family harmony. But sitting there surrounded by the evidence of their skewed priorities looking at their shocked faces as they realized I held actual power in this dynamic. I found it impossible to maintain the diplomatic tone I'd been using. "Amanda, honey," Mom started, her voice taking on that soothing quality she used when she was trying to de-escalate conflicts. "I think there might be some misunderstanding here. The shed situation is just temporary, just until we can figure out better arrangements. And asking for your help with expenses, that's just what families do for each other." "What families do for each other," I repeated, letting the words settle before continuing. "Let me ask you something, Mom. When was the last time anyone in this family did something for me? When was the last time anyone considered my needs, or my comfort, or my feelings when making decisions that affected me?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to come up with an immediate answer. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she searched for examples of family consideration that apparently didn't exist. "The shed has a heater," Dad said finally, as if that solved everything. "And you've always been independent. We thought you'd be fine with a little inconvenience." A little inconvenience. Spending a night in sub-freezing temperatures was a little inconvenience, comparable to a delayed flight or a broken air conditioner. The casual dismissal of my discomfort was so complete, so matter-of-fact, that it took my breath away. $18,000, I said, changing the subject back to the concrete reality of their debt. "That's what you owe me, with interest accumulating daily. Now, I could demand immediate payment, which would probably force you to sell the house since I'm guessing you don't have that kind of cash lying around." The three of them exchanged glances, confirming what I'd already suspected about their liquid assets. Brandon's expensive Christmas haul suddenly looked less like generosity and more like financial irresponsibility on a spectacular scale. "Or," I continued, "I could work out a payment plan. Something reasonable. Something that takes into account your actual financial situation rather than the fictional version you've been presenting." "What kind of payment plan?" Dad asked, his voice careful but hopeful. I pretended to consider the question, though I'd already worked out the terms during my walk that morning. The goal wasn't to bankrupt them or force them from their home. The goal was to establish a new dynamic, one based on respect rather than exploitation, one where my contributions were acknowledged and valued rather than simply expected. $1,000 a month, I said, borrowing the exact number they'd proposed for my contribution to their household expenses. "For 18 months, plus a reasonable interest rate. Payments due on the 1st of each month. No exceptions, no delays." The symmetry was perfect, and I could see the moment when they realized what I'd done. They'd asked me to pay $1,000 a month to help with their financial problems. Now I was asking them to pay me $1,000 a month to solve a financial problem they hadn't even known existed. "That's..." Brandon started, then stopped, apparently unable to finish the sentence. "That's fair," I said. "That's exactly what you asked me to contribute this morning. So presumably it's an amount you consider reasonable for family members to pay." "But that was different," Mom protested. "That was to help with ongoing expenses, to keep the family together. And this is to pay off a debt that I took on to keep the family house," I countered. I'd say the situations are remarkably similar. Dad was doing mental calculations, probably trying to figure out where they'd find $1,000 a month when they'd just spent several thousand on Christmas presents for Brandon. The math wasn't working out in their favor, and I could see the reality of their situation beginning to sink in. "What if we can't make the payments?" he asked quietly. "Then I exercise my rights as a lien holder," I said matter-of-factly. "I force the sale of the property to recover my investment, plus costs and additional penalties." The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone I'd been using all morning, but the impact was immediate and devastating. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about the house that had been in the Parker family for 3 generations, the house that represented their identity and their legacy, The house that they'd assumed would always be theirs regardless of their financial decisions. "You'd really do that?" Mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'd really take our home?" "I don't want to take your home," I said honestly. "I want you to understand what I've already given you. I want you to recognize that I'm not just the family member you turn to when you need money. I'm the family member who saved your house when you couldn't." The living room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that had provided the soundtrack to countless family gatherings over the years. But this gathering felt different, weighted with the kind of revelation that changes relationships permanently. "I need some air," Brandon said suddenly, standing up from his position on the floor. "This is all just... I need to think." He walked out of the room without looking back, leaving his expensive Christmas presents scattered around the tree like abandoned toys. I could hear his footsteps on the stairs, followed by the sound of his bedroom door closing with more force than necessary. Mom and Dad remained on the couch, looking shell-shocked and uncertain. The carefully orchestrated Christmas morning had been completely derailed, replaced by a conversation none of them had seen coming. The balance of power in the Parker family had shifted so dramatically that none of us quite knew how to proceed. "Amanda," Dad said finally, his voice tired and defeated, "what do you want from us?" It was a good question, and one I'd been asking myself since the moment I'd decided to reveal the tax lien. What did I want? Revenge? Respect? Recognition? An apology for years of being treated as less valuable than Brandon? A guarantee that I'd never have to sleep in the shed again? "I want to be treated like family," I said simply. "Real family. Not the kind of family member who gets called when you need money and ignored when you don't. Not the kind of family member who sleeps outside while others sleep in comfort. I want to matter as much as Brandon matters. I want my contributions to be valued as much as his potential is valued." The words hung in the air, simple but profound. After 26 years of accepting whatever scraps of attention and affection were left over after Brandon's needs were met, I was finally asking for equality, not special treatment, not revenge, just the basic respect that should have been mine from the beginning. "Of course you matter," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You've always mattered." "Have I?" I asked. "Because it doesn't feel that way when I'm sleeping in a shed while Brandon gets the master bedroom. It doesn't feel that way when you spend thousands on his Christmas presents and give me candles and gift cards. It doesn't feel that way when you ask me to subsidize his lifestyle while he pursues another guaranteed-to-fail business venture." Each example hit like a small slap, forcing them to confront the pattern they'd probably convinced themselves didn't exist. The favoritism that was so obvious to everyone except the people perpetrating it. "We can figure this out," Dad said, though he sounded more hopeful than confident. "We can make this work for everyone." "I hope so," I said, standing up from the couch and heading toward the door. "Because you have until January 1st to make your first payment. After that, the terms become much less negotiable." I left them sitting in the living room, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and expensive gifts, and the shattered remains of their assumptions about family dynamics. The house felt different as I walked through it, less like a childhood home and more like a piece of property that I happened to have legal claim to. The shed looked different too when I stepped outside. It wasn't just the place where they'd exiled me anymore. It was evidence of their poor judgment, proof that they'd underestimated the person they thought they could manipulate and control. Christmas morning had taken an unexpected turn, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Not in the shed, not on the margins of the family, but in the position of power that I'd earned through years of responsible behavior and one very strategic financial decision. The next few hours would tell me everything I needed to know about whether the Parker family was capable of change or whether my future lay somewhere else entirely. The afternoon stretched, endlessly, filled with the kind of tense silence that follows a conversation nobody knows how to continue. I'd retreated to the kitchen with a cup of coffee, partly to give them space to process what I'd revealed, and partly because I needed time to think about what came next. Through the window, I could see neighbors walking their dogs and children, playing in the snow, normal families enjoying a normal Christmas afternoon without legal documents and property liens complicating their holiday celebrations. My phone had been buzzing intermittently with text messages, mostly from Aunt Carol asking how Christmas morning had gone. I'd sent her a brief message saying we'd talk later, but I could tell from her follow-up questions that she sensed something significant had happened. Carol had always been perceptive about family dynamics, probably because she'd watched the Parker dysfunction from the outside for years. Around 2 p.m, I heard movement from the living room, followed by the sound of hushed voices, engaged in what was clearly an intense discussion. I couldn't make out the specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were trying to figure out how to handle the situation I'd created, probably debating whether to treat it as a temporary crisis that could be managed or a permanent shift that required fundamental changes to their assumptions about family hierarchy. Brandon was the first to emerge from their impromptu family meeting, appearing in the kitchen doorway with the kind of determined expression he usually wore when he was about to make what he considered a compelling argument. He'd changed clothes, again, trading his expensive Christmas sweater for a more casual outfit that was probably intended to make him seem more relatable and less like someone whose lifestyle was funded by other people's money. "So I've been thinking about what you said earlier," he began, settling into the chair across from me at the kitchen table. His tone was carefully measured, the voice he used when he was trying to sound reasonable and mature, the voice that had probably convinced multiple investors to part with their money over the years. "Which part?" I asked, though I had a feeling I knew where this conversation was heading. "The whole tax lien situation," he said, leaning forward slightly as if we were conspirators working on the same project. "I think there might be a way to make this work for everyone, a way to turn this into a win-win scenario." Win-win scenario. Business speak for a situation where he got what he wanted while convincing me that I was also getting something valuable. I'd heard variations of this pitch from Brandon for years, usually when he needed money or wanted to avoid consequences for his financial irresponsibility. "I'm listening," I said, curious to hear how he planned to spin $18,000 of debt into a positive opportunity. "The thing is, you're obviously good with money," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward my phone as if the legal documents were physically present on the table. "I mean, you had $18,000 sitting around to pay off property taxes. That's impressive financial planning." The compliment was obviously strategic, an attempt to butter me up before delivering whatever proposal he'd worked out with Mom and Dad. But there was also something insulting about the surprise in his voice, as if responsible financial management was such an unexpected trait that it deserved special recognition. "I save money instead of spending it on things I can't afford," I said simply. "It's not complicated." "Right, exactly," he said, apparently missing the implied criticism of his own spending habits. "And that's why I think we could actually partner on something here. Instead of just making payments on this debt, what if we turned it into an investment opportunity?" Partnership. Investment opportunity. I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to transform his family's financial crisis into another one of his entrepreneurial ventures. The audacity was breathtaking, but also predictable. Brandon had never met a problem he couldn't rebrand as a business opportunity. "What kind of investment opportunity?" I asked, genuinely curious about how far he'd take this pitch. "Well, you've essentially got equity in the house now, right?" he said, his voice gaining enthusiasm as he warmed to his topic. "And property values in this area have been going up. So instead of just collecting payments, you could invest that money in renovation projects that would increase the overall value of the property." I stared at him for a moment, trying to process the logic of what he was suggesting. Apparently, his solution to owing me $18,000 was for me to spend additional money improving their house, with the theoretical promise of future returns based on property appreciation. So, let me understand this correctly, I said slowly. You owe me $18,000. Your solution is for me to give you more money in the form of renovation investments, with the hope that someday the house might be worth enough to justify the additional expenditure. When you put it like that, it sounds weird, he admitted, his enthusiasm dimming slightly. But think about it from a portfolio perspective. Real estate is always a solid investment, and if you're already tied to this property anyway— Brandon, I interrupted, I'm not looking for investment opportunities. I'm looking for the money you owe me. But that's such a limited way of thinking about this, he protested, leaning back in his chair with the frustrated expression he wore when people failed to appreciate his business genius. You're thinking like an employee instead of thinking like an entrepreneur. Thinking like an employee, as if having a steady job and financial stability was somehow inferior to his approach of living off other people's money while pursuing ventures that never materialized. As if my boring, responsible approach to money management was less sophisticated than his strategy of accumulating debt and calling it investment. I think like someone who expects to be paid when people owe me money, I said. That's not limited thinking, that's basic adulting. He was quiet for a moment, probably trying to figure out why his pitch wasn't landing the way he'd expected. I could almost see him recalibrating, searching for a different angle that might be more persuasive. Look, I know things have been tense lately, he said, shifting to a more personal tone. And I know the whole shed situation probably wasn't ideal. But you have to understand, I'm at a really critical point with my projects right now. This investor interest could be the breakthrough I've been working toward for years. Critical point. Breakthrough. I'd been hearing variations of this story for as long as Brandon had been pursuing entrepreneurial ventures. There was always a critical moment just around the corner, always a breakthrough that was about to change everything. The only thing that ever actually changed was the specific details of the story. What does your business breakthrough have to do with the money you owe me? I asked. Because if this deal goes through, if these investors come on board, I'll be able to pay you back everything plus interest, probably within 6 months, he said, his voice gaining excitement again. But I need to be able to focus on the business development right now, not worry about monthly payments and debt obligations. There it was. The real proposal wasn't about investment opportunities or partnerships. It was about delaying payment until his latest venture either succeeded spectacularly or failed completely. He wanted me to essentially gamble my $18,000 on his business acumen, with no guarantees and no collateral beyond his own optimism. And if the investors don't come through? I asked. If this project fails like the others? It won't fail, he said with the kind of absolute certainty that was either inspiring or delusional, depending on your perspective. This is different. This is the real deal. Brandon, I've heard this exact conversation before, I said, setting down my coffee cup with enough force to make my point clear. Different investors, different projects, same promises about this time being different. The only thing that's actually consistent is that none of them ever work out. His face flushed slightly, and I could see anger beginning to replace the persuasive charm he'd been attempting. Brandon didn't handle criticism well, especially when it came to his business ventures. Questioning his entrepreneurial judgment was one of those family taboos that I'd apparently just violated. You don't understand the market dynamics, he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. These aren't get-rich-quick schemes. These are legitimate business opportunities that require patience and strategic thinking. Strategic thinking. From someone who just suggested I invest more money in a house I already held a lien on, as if doubling down on the same asset was somehow diversification. From someone who thought the solution to debt was more debt, packaged as opportunity. Maybe I don't understand market dynamics, I agreed. But I understand loan payments, $1,000 a month, starting January 1st. That's not a business negotiation. That's a legal obligation. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's snowblower. Brandon stared at me with the kind of frustrated confusion that people get when their usual manipulation tactics stop working. He'd probably expected this conversation to end with me agreeing to some modified payment plan that would essentially let him off the hook. "This is really how you want to handle family business?" he asked, his tone shifting toward accusation. "With legal threats and payment schedules? Whatever happened to forgiveness and working together?" Forgiveness. Working together. I wondered if he could hear the irony in his own words, if he realized he was asking for forgiveness from someone who'd been sleeping in a shed while he enjoyed the master bedroom. If he understood that working together typically involved reciprocal effort rather than one person making all the sacrifices. "I've been forgiving and working together for years," I said calmly. "It got me a shed and a demand for monthly financial contributions. I think it's time to try a different approach." Before he could respond, Mom appeared in the kitchen doorway, probably having monitored our conversation from the living room. She had that careful, diplomatic expression she wore when she was trying to mediate family conflicts, the look that suggested she was about to propose a compromise that would somehow satisfy everyone while solving nothing. "I hope you two are finding some common ground," she said, settling into the chair next to Brandon with the kind of deliberate casualness that indicated this interruption was anything but spontaneous. "We're discussing payment options," I said before Brandon could launch into another entrepreneurial pitch. "About that," Mom said, her voice taking on that bright, problem-solving tone she used when she was about to present what she considered a brilliant solution. "Dad and I have been talking, and we think we might have found a way to handle this situation that works for everyone." Here it came. The Parker family compromise, carefully designed to maintain the status quo while creating the illusion of meaningful change. I'd seen this process countless times over the years, usually deployed when Brandon's behavior became too problematic to ignore completely, but not quite bad enough to warrant actual consequences. "We're listening," I said, though I suspected I already knew the general shape of what she was about to propose. "Well, clearly the current living arrangements aren't working for anyone," she began, carefully avoiding any direct acknowledgement that making me sleep in a shed had been inappropriate. "And obviously, we need to address the financial situation you've brought to our attention." The financial situation I'd brought to their attention, as if the property tax debt was news to them, as if they hadn't been complaining about it for months before I'd quietly resolved it. As if my revelation was the problem, rather than their failure to keep track of their own financial obligations. "So, we were thinking," she continued, "what if we made some adjustments that would benefit everyone? You could move back into your old bedroom, we could work out a reasonable payment plan for the tax situation, and Brandon could transition to the guest room while he focuses on his business development." The proposal was so perfectly calibrated to sound fair, while changing almost nothing that I had to admire its construction. I would get my childhood bedroom back, which was generous compared to the shed, but still positioned me as secondary to Brandon's needs. They would make payments on the debt they owed me, but only after I'd agreed to modified terms that would probably stretch the timeline indefinitely. And Brandon would sacrifice the master bedroom, but retain the guest room, maintaining his position as the family member whose comfort mattered most. "What kind of reasonable payment plan?" I asked. "Maybe $500 a month instead of $1,000. Dad's voice came from the doorway as he joined the kitchen conference. "With the understanding that if Brandon's business takes off, we could accelerate the payments. $500 a month, half of what they'd asked me to contribute to their household expenses that morning, half of what I'd proposed based on their own suggested amount. And even that reduced payment would be conditional on Brandon's business success, which meant it could be delayed or modified whenever his latest venture required their financial attention. So let me make sure I understand this," I said, looking at each of them in turn. You want me to accept half the payment you originally agreed to, with the possibility of delays if Brandon needs financial support for his projects, in exchange for getting my childhood bedroom back. When you put it like that, it sounds transactional, Mom protested. This is about finding a solution that works for the whole family. It is transactional, I said. You owe me money. I'm proposing terms for repayment. The only question is whether those terms are acceptable to you. The directness of my response seemed to catch them off guard. They'd expected negotiation, compromise, the kind of family discussion where everyone's feelings were considered, and some middle ground was discovered that allowed everyone to maintain their dignity. Instead, I was treating this like the business transaction it had always been, even when they'd disguised it as family obligation. Amanda, honey, Mom said, her voice taking on that patient maternal tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. Sometimes in families we have to be flexible. We have to consider everyone's circumstances and find ways to help each other through difficult times. I agree completely, I said. That's exactly why I paid your property taxes 6 months ago instead of letting the county foreclose on your house. That was flexibility. That was helping family through difficult times. The silence that followed was profound. I'd turned their own rhetoric back on them, pointing out that I'd already demonstrated the kind of family loyalty they were now asking me to show again. The difference was that my help had been real and substantial, while what they were offering, in return, was mostly symbolic. Look, Brandon said, apparently deciding to abandon his business pitch in favor of a more emotional appeal. I know I haven't always been the most responsible person. I know I've made mistakes with money and business decisions, but this time really is different. How is it different? I asked. Because I've learned from those mistakes, he said earnestly. Because I understand now what went wrong before, and I know how to avoid those problems this time. It was the same speech he'd given after every failed venture, the same promises of lessons learned and wisdom gained. The only thing that ever actually changed was his age and the amount of other people's money he'd wasted pursuing dreams that existed only in his imagination. Brandon, I hope this project works out for you, I said, and I meant it. I genuinely hope you find the success you've been looking for, but that hope doesn't pay the money you owe me. So that's it? He asked, his voice rising with frustration. You're just going to treat me like some stranger who defaulted on a loan? You're going to hold this over our heads like we're not even family? The accusation stung, partly because there was a grain of truth in it. I was treating this like a business transaction rather than a family matter. But the alternative was to continue the pattern that had defined our relationship for years, where my contributions were taken for granted and my needs were considered negotiable. You made me sleep in a shed, Brandon, I said quietly. You demanded money from me to subsidize your lifestyle while you pursue projects that never work out. You spent this morning opening thousands of dollars worth of Christmas presents while I got candles and gift cards. At what point do I get to stop pretending that this family treats me like family? The question hung in the air like a challenge. For years, I'd been the one making accommodations, accepting excuses, finding ways to rationalize their treatment of me as anything other than what it obviously was. Now I was asking them to defend that treatment, to explain why I should continue accepting it. We do treat you like family, Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. You're our daughter. You'll always be our daughter. Then start treating me like Brandon is your son, I said. Give me the same consideration you give him. Value my contributions the way you value his potential. Make my comfort as important as his comfort. It's not that simple, Dad said. Brandon has different needs right now. He's at a critical juncture in his career development. And I have different needs too, I said. I need to not sleep in sheds. I need to not be asked for money while watching thousands of dollars get spent on photography equipment. I need to not be treated like the family member who exists to solve everyone else's problems. The conversation was beginning to feel circular. with each side restating their position without any apparent movement toward resolution. They wanted me to accept less money, modified terms, and continued second-class treatment in exchange for getting my bedroom back. I wanted them to honor their debt and start treating me with the same respect they automatically granted to Brandon. "Maybe we all need some time to think about this," Mom suggested, clearly recognizing that the kitchen conference wasn't producing the compromise she'd hoped for. "That's fine," I said, "but the deadline doesn't change. January 1st, first payment due. After that, we move to legal enforcement of the lien." "You'd really do that?" Dad asked. "You'd really force us to sell our house over this?" "I don't want to force anything," I said honestly. "I want you to pay what you owe me and start treating me like I matter as much as Brandon matters. If you can't do that, then yes, I'll exercise my legal rights." They left the kitchen one by one, each of them wearing the kind of defeated expression that suggested the afternoon's negotiations hadn't gone according to plan. I remained at the table with my now cold coffee, watching the winter afternoon fade toward evening through the window. My phone buzzed with another text from Aunt Carol, this one more insistent about wanting to know how Christmas was going. I finally called her back, partly because I needed to talk to someone who wasn't emotionally invested in maintaining Parker family mythology. "Amanda!" Her voice was warm but concerned. "I've been worried about you all day. How are things going?" "With the shed situation?" "The shed situation has been resolved," I said, and then found myself telling her everything. The property tax line, the Christmas morning revelation, the afternoon of failed negotiations. Carol listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or approval. "My God," she said when I finished. "You've been planning this for months." "Not planning exactly," I said. "More like waiting for the right moment to use the leverage I accidentally created." "Accidentally? My ass," she said with a laugh. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you paid those taxes. Maybe not consciously, but some part of you knew you were creating options for yourself." She might have been right. Looking back on the decision to pay the property taxes, I couldn't remember my motivations being entirely altruistic. There had been something satisfying about having that kind of power, even if I'd never imagined using it the way I was using it now. "What happens next?" she asked. "I guess we find out whether they're willing to change," I said. "Whether they value keeping the house more than they value keeping Brandon comfortable. And if they're not? Then I follow through on the legal process," I said, "and probably start looking for a new family to spend Christmas with." "Well, you'll always have a place at my table," she said firmly. "Blood relatives or not, family is supposed to lift you up, not tear you down." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of the kitchen, thinking about what she'd said. Family was supposed to lift you up. The Parker family had spent years doing the opposite, systematically diminishing my worth while elevating Brandon's, convincing me that their treatment was normal and my expectations were unreasonable. But sitting there with $18,000 worth of leverage in my pocket, watching them scramble to maintain control of a situation they'd never seen coming, I felt something I'd rarely experienced in this house. I felt powerful. I felt valuable. I felt like maybe, for the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I belonged. The evening would bring more conversations, more attempts at negotiation, more efforts to convince me that family loyalty meant accepting whatever terms they chose to offer. But the fundamental dynamic had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. I wasn't the desperate family member begging for acceptance anymore. I was the person holding all the cards, and it was time for them to decide what they were willing to pay to keep playing the game. Christmas evening arrived with the kind of heavy snow that transformed the whole neighborhood into a winter postcard. But inside the Parker house, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. I'd spent the late afternoon in my old bedroom, which Mom had hastily prepared as a gesture of goodwill, though the fact that it had taken a legal threat to get me out of the shed wasn't lost on any of us. The room looked exactly as I'd left it when I moved out for college, complete with faded band posters and the twin bed that had seemed perfectly adequate when I was 17, but now felt cramped and childish. Still, it was warm and dry, which put it several steps above the accommodations I'd had the night before. I could hear movement throughout the house as the family prepared for what was traditionally our Christmas evening dinner, a more casual affair than the elaborate breakfast, but still an important Parker family ritual. The sounds were familiar but somehow different now, filtered through the knowledge that everything between us had fundamentally changed. My phone rang just before 6, David Morrison's name appearing on the screen. I'd asked him to prepare additional documentation in case the family decided to test my resolve, and apparently he'd spent his Christmas afternoon working on legal papers instead of enjoying time with his own family. "I've got everything ready," he said without preamble. "Formal demand letters, foreclosure procedures, everything you might need if this goes sideways. But Amanda, I have to ask one more time. Are you absolutely sure about this approach?" "They made me sleep in a shed, David," I said, and somehow, saying it out loud to someone outside the family made it sound even more absurd than it had felt at the time, while asking me for money to support the person who got the master bedroom. "Jesus," he said quietly. "I thought this was about typical family financial drama. I didn't realize they were actually abusing you." Abuse? I'd never thought of it in those terms, but hearing David use that word made something click into place. It wasn't physical abuse, wasn't the kind of dramatic mistreatment that would make headlines or warrant police intervention. But it was abuse nonetheless, systematic and deliberate, designed to keep me in a subordinate position while extracting maximum value from my presence in their lives. "The papers will be ready first thing Monday morning," he continued, "but I'm hoping it doesn't come to that." "So am I said, though I was no longer sure which outcome I actually preferred. A soft knock on my bedroom door interrupted the call, and Mom's voice came through the thin wood with carefully modulated cheerfulness. "Amanda, honey, dinner's almost ready. We're hoping you'll join us." "I'll be down in a minute," I called, back, ending the call with David and taking a moment to steel myself for whatever the evening might bring. The dining room had been reset for Christmas evening, with candles flickering on the table and the good china once again on display. Someone had opened a bottle of wine, probably hoping that alcohol would soften the edges of our earlier conversations and make the remainder of the holiday more manageable. Brandon was already seated, wearing a different expensive sweater and an expression that suggested he'd spent the afternoon working on a new strategy for dealing with our changed family dynamics. Dad looked tired and older than he had that morning, the weight of $18,000 in unexpected debt apparently taking its toll. Mom bustled around serving food with determined cheerfulness, as if maintaining the rituals of family. Dinner could somehow restore normalcy to a situation that had moved far beyond normal. "This looks wonderful," I said, settling into my traditional seat and accepting a glass of wine that I probably shouldn't drink given the day's emotional intensity. But the gesture felt important, a small acknowledgement that despite everything, we were still attempting to function as a family. The meal began quietly, with everyone focused on their plates and the comfortable routine of passing dishes and making small talk about the food. It was almost possible to pretend that the morning's revelations hadn't happened, that we were just the Parker family enjoying a traditional Christmas dinner together. But the pretense couldn't last. About halfway through the main course, Dad cleared his throat in the way that indicated he was about to address something serious, and I felt my stomach tighten in anticipation. "Amanda, we've been talking about your situation all afternoon," he began, his voice careful and measured. "And we want you to know that we understand why you're upset. Your situation, not our debt, not their treatment of me, but my situation, as if my response to their behavior was the real problem that needed to be addressed. We've made some decisions," Mom added, setting down her fork and folding her hands in front of her, with the kind of deliberate composure that suggested this speech had been rehearsed. "Changes that we think will help everyone feel more comfortable moving forward." I waited. curious to see what they'd come up with during their afternoon of crisis management. Brandon was watching me carefully, probably trying to gauge my reaction to whatever proposal they were about to present. First, Dad continued, we want to formalize our acknowledgement of what you did with the property taxes. You saved our house, and that deserves recognition. Recognition. After 6 months of taking credit for my assistance, they were finally willing to acknowledge what I'd done. It was progress, though the kind of progress that shouldn't have required legal threats to achieve. Second, Mom said, we're prepared to commit to a payment schedule for the debt. Not the full $1,000 you initially proposed, but a realistic amount that we can sustain over time. Realistic amount. Translation: less money than they owed me, spread over a longer period than I'd suggested, probably with escape clauses that would allow them to modify or suspend payments when convenient. And third, Brandon said, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down, I want to apologize for some of the things I said earlier. You were right that I haven't always been as responsible as I should have been. An apology from Brandon was so unprecedented that I almost choked on my wine. Not a full apology, not an acknowledgement of years of financial irresponsibility and entitled behavior, but a carefully worded admission that he hadn't always been perfect. It was the kind of minimal accountability that might have satisfied me years ago, when I was still hoping for crumbs of recognition from the family. What kind of payment schedule? I asked, focusing on the concrete rather than the emotional. Gestures. $600 a month, Dad said, for 30 months. It's more than we initially suggested this afternoon, but still manageable given our other obligations. $600 a month for 30 months. $18,000 with no interest, spread over 2.5 years instead of the 18 months I'd proposed. They'd essentially asked me to provide them with an interest-free loan while they continued funding Brandon's lifestyle and business ventures. That's generous, I said carefully, but it doesn't include interest or penalties, which are part of the legal obligation. We're family, Mom said, her voice taking on that pleading tone she used when she wanted to appeal to my better nature. Surely we can work something out that doesn't involve treating each other like strangers. Family. There was that word again, deployed like a magic spell that was supposed to make financial obligations disappear, and reasonable expectations seem unreasonable. The same word they'd used to justify making me sleep in a shed while asking for money, to support Brandon's expensive habits. If we're family, I said, then why did it take a legal threat for you to acknowledge what I did for you? Why did I have to spend last night in a freezing shed while Brandon slept in the master bedroom? Why is my financial contribution considered a family obligation while his lack of contribution is considered acceptable? The questions hung in the air like challenges, forcing them to confront the contradictions in their own rhetoric. They wanted to claim family loyalty when it benefited them, but they hadn't extended that same loyalty to me when it would have required sacrifice on their part. The shed situation was a mistake, Dad admitted, though his tone suggested it was a minor oversight rather than a deliberate act of cruelty. We didn't think through the implications properly. You didn't think through the implications of making your daughter sleep outside in December? I asked. What implications did you think there would be? We thought you'd be fine, Brandon said, his voice defensive. You've always been tough, independent. We figured you could handle a little discomfort. A little discomfort. Hypothermia was a little discomfort. Frostbite was a little discomfort. The casual dismissal of my physical safety was so complete that it took my breath away. Would you have made those same assumptions about Brandon? I asked. Would you have asked him to sleep in the shed because he's tough and independent? The silence that followed was answer enough. We all knew that Brandon would never have been asked to make that sacrifice, that his comfort and safety would have been protected regardless of space constraints or family logistics. The double standard was so obvious that even they couldn't deny it. Look, Brandon said, apparently deciding to abandon the defensive approach in favor of something more direct. I know things have been unequal. I know I've had advantages that you haven't had. But that doesn't mean the solution is to destroy the family over money. Destroy the family over money. As if enforcing reasonable boundaries and expecting equal treatment was somehow destructive. As if my refusal to continue accepting unacceptable treatment was the real threat to family unity. I'm not trying to destroy anything, I said. I'm trying to establish a relationship based on mutual respect instead of one-sided obligation. I'm trying to be treated like I matter as much as you matter. You do matter, Mom said quickly. You've always mattered. You're our daughter, and we love you. Then start showing it, I said. Stop treating my contributions like they're expected, and start treating them like they're valued. Stop asking me to subsidize Brandon's lifestyle while he pursues projects that never work out. Stop making my comfort secondary to his comfort. The conversation continued for another hour, circling around the same basic issues without reaching any real resolution. They wanted me to accept modified terms that would essentially maintain the status quo while creating the illusion of change. I wanted them to honor their debt and start treating me with the same consideration they automatically granted to Brandon. By the time we finished dinner, it was clear that no amount of discussion was going to bridge the gap between what they were willing to offer and what I was willing to accept. They'd drawn their line at $600 a month with no interest and a few symbolic gestures toward better treatment. I'd drawn mine at full payment with interest and genuine equality within the family dynamic. I think we all need to sleep on this, Mom said as we cleared the table, her voice tired and strained. Maybe things will look different in the morning. But things wouldn't look different in the morning, and we all knew it. The fundamental issue wasn't about money or payment schedules or legal obligations. It was about power and respect, and whether the Parker family was capable of treating all its members as equally valuable. I spent that evening in my childhood bedroom, scrolling through my phone and thinking about the conversations I'd had over the past 2 days. The legal documents David had prepared were ready to be filed. The property lion gave me all the leverage I needed to force compliance with my demands. The family that had dismissed me for years was finally being forced to take me seriously. But somehow, the victory felt hollow. I'd won the battle, established my power, proven that I couldn't be taken for granted anymore. But in the process, I'd also confirmed something I'd suspected for years. The Parker family's love was transactional, conditional, based on what I could provide rather than who I was. My phone buzzed with a text message from Aunt Carol. How did the rest of Christmas go? Are you okay? I stared at the question for a long time before responding. Was I okay? I was warm and dry, sleeping in a real bed instead of a freezing shed. I had legal documents that protected my interests and guaranteed repayment of my loan. I'd finally stood up to years of unequal treatment and demanded the respect I deserved. But I was also facing the possibility that enforcing those demands might cost me the only family I'd ever known, dysfunctional as it was. The prospect of spending future holidays alone, of building a life completely separate from the people who'd raised me, was both liberating and terrifying. I'm fine, I texted back, just figuring some things out. Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, she responded almost immediately. You deserve so much better than how they've treated you. The next morning brought no magical resolution, no sudden burst of family enlightenment that would make everything perfect. Over breakfast, we repeated the same conversations we'd had the night before, with the same positions and the same lack of movement toward compromise. By noon, it was clear that the Christmas weekend was over in all but name. Brandon had retreated to his room with his new camera equipment, probably working on content for his latest business venture. Mom and Dad moved around the house with the kind of careful politeness that indicated they were avoiding any topic that might restart our financial discussions. I packed my things methodically, folding clothes and gathering toiletries with the deliberate calm of someone who'd made an important decision. The legal deadline I'd set was still a week away, but the emotional deadline had already passed. We'd reached the limit of what discussion could accomplish. "You don't have to leave today," Mom said, appearing in my doorway as I zipped up my suitcase. "We could try talking about this some more." "I think we've said everything we need to say," I replied, not unkindly, but with finality. "You know what I'm asking for, and you know what I'm willing to accept. The rest is up to you." She stood there for a moment, probably hoping I'd change my mind or offer some last-minute compromise. That would let everyone save face. But I'd spent too many years compromising, accepting partial solutions that solved nothing while maintaining the appearance of family harmony. "Amanda," she said finally, her voice small and uncertain, "what happens if we can't meet your terms? What happens to us?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since Christmas morning. What did happen to a family when financial leverage replaced emotional connection? What did happen when legal obligations became more reliable than family loyalty? "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I know what happens if I keep accepting the way things have been. I become smaller and smaller until there's nothing left of me but the parts that serve your needs." The drive back to Milwaukee was quiet and reflective. 4 hours of highway time to process what had happened and think about what came next. The snow had stopped, leaving the landscape clean and bright under a winter sun that made everything look fresh and new. My phone rang as I was pulling into my apartment complex, David Morrison's name appearing on the screen. "How did the rest of the weekend go?" he asked. "About like you'd expect," I said. "They're not willing to meet the terms, and I'm not willing to accept their counteroffer." "So we move forward with the legal process." "We move forward," I confirmed. "File everything Monday morning." "Amanda," he said, his voice gentle but concerned, "are you sure this is what you want? Once we start formal proceedings, it's going to be very difficult to walk back." I thought about the question as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, key in hand, ready to return to the life I'd built independently of Parker family dynamics. Was this what I wanted? Did I want to potentially destroy my relationship with my parents and brother over $18,000 and a principal? "I want to be treated like I matter," I said finally. "If enforcing that legally is the only way to make it happen, then yes, this is what I want." The apartment felt peaceful after the emotional intensity of the weekend, quiet and calm and completely mine. No one here expected me to subsidize their lifestyle or sleep in uncomfortable places or accept treatment that diminished my worth. No one here confused love with exploitation or mistook loyalty for enabling. My phone buzzed with one final text message from Brandon. "I hope you know what you're doing. Some things are more important than money." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "You're right. Respect is more important than money. That's exactly why I'm doing this." 3 days later, David called to tell me the papers had been served. The Parker family had 30 days to respond with full payment or face foreclosure proceedings. Mom had apparently answered the door when the process server arrived, and according to David's contact, she'd looked genuinely shocked to receive the formal legal documents. "Any regrets?" he asked. I looked around my small but comfortable apartment, at the life I'd built through my own efforts, at the peace that came from not having to navigate family politics and manage other people's emotions. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. "No regrets," I said. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I'm worth." Whether the Parker family chose to pay that worth or lose their house in the process was entirely up to them. Either way, I was finally free from the shed they'd built around my expectations. Free to demand the respect I'd always deserved. Free to build a life based on my own value rather than their assessment of it. Some gifts are worth more than money. Some Christmas mornings change everything. And sometimes the best thing you can give yourself is the knowledge that you matter enough to fight for better treatment, even if that fight cost you the only family you've ever known. The property taxes were just the beginning. The real gift was learning that I didn't have to accept less than I deserved, not from family, not from anyone. And that was worth more than any house. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.